Welcome to Chapter 6. In this chapter, we're going to learn the imperfect, active, indicative tense of the verbs. We're also going to take some time and look at demonstrative pronouns. I'm sure you all remember Vera Verb. She introduced us to the present tense verbs, and as you remember, she'll be with us all along. And just to remember that one aspect of Vera that we have only looked at only one point so far is her tense tiers. And her tense tiers remind us that verbs come in different tenses. And the tense tells us the time of the action as well as the type of the action. So far, you've learned only the present tense, which means that the action is happening now in the present time and that the action is continuous, that is, it's ongoing. Today, Vera is going to introduce us to another tense of hers, and that is known as the imperfect tense. And this tense means that the action has happened in the past, but it was with an ongoing, that is, a continuous action. Now, just as a reminder, as we looked at the present tense, we saw that creating Greek verbs or forming them is sort of like buying a car. You start off with the basic model, and then you accessorize, you add something to it. And in the present tense, what we discovered is that the present tense verb was constructed by taking the verb stem plus an ending. And in that case, it was, for instance, lu plus our present tense endings, in this case omega, equaling luo, and then our translation is I loose or I am loosing, which gives us the indication not only of present time, but continuous action. Today, as we look at the imperfect tense, we're going to add a little bit more to the accessories on the verb stem. Instead of just having two parts to our verb tense, the imperfect tense has three. We have our verb stem there in the middle, as we always did with the present tense, and we have our verb ending at the end, as we did with the present tense. But now we're going to put something at the beginning of the verb stem. We're going to put something called a prefixed augment. And this is the way it looks. At the bottom of your screen there, you'll see that we're going to have an epsilon augment, and we're going to add that to the beginning of our stem, and then we're going to put our imperfect ending, which is on, and so what we end up there with is the word eluon, and our translation is going to be I was loosing. And so even in the difference of the translation, notice in the present tense it's luo, I loose, but in the imperfect tense it's eluon, I was loosing, both giving the idea of ongoing action, only in the present tense the action is helping now, whereas in the imperfect tense it was happening in the past. Let's take a look at our imperfect tense paradigm for today. Here you can see that I've put both the singular and the plural for you. And then on the left-hand column are first, second, and third person. So going through this, you can notice that we have the following. Eluan, I was loosing. Elus, you were loosing. Elue, or eluen, with our movable nu, he, she, or it was loosing. Eluamen, we were loosing. Elueta, you were loosing, and eluan, they were loosing. Let's just stop for a moment and make a few observations. Notice again, as I've told you, that every one of these verbs now has a prefixed augment on the front of it. There is an epsilon that precedes our stem, and you can see it. I've got it marked out there for you in the blue. Following our prefixed augment is the stem from lu, that you've already been seeing as we've gone through our verbs in the present tense as well as in the middle passive voice. And then here we have at the end of that in red are our imperfect endings. On, s, n, amen, etta, on. Notice that in the plural first and second person, amen and etta, are the very same endings that you had in the present active. That means that there is a little potential here for confusion between eluamen and luamen, and that's why it's important that you pay attention to your prefixed augment. And again, as I've mentioned before, sometimes it's helpful to pronounce these words out loud, because sometimes your eyes will not necessarily pick up that augment, and it'll just think that you're dealing with the present active, and in fact, you're dealing with the imperfect active. The difference between luamen and luetta is eluamen and eluetta. So keep that in mind, the importance of the augment. Notice also that the first person singular and the third person plural look exactly the same. Eluan, eluan. There is virtually no difference in spelling. In this case, how will you know whether you're dealing with a first person singular or a third person plural? Context will be your guide. You will have either a singular nominative subject in the case of the first person singular or a plural nominative subject in the case of the third person plural. So context will be your guide, although right now the potential for confusion may look very great. Rest assured that once you get into working your translations, I would say 99% of the time it'll be very clear to you whether you're dealing with a first person singular or a third person plural. One last thing before we move on to the next paradigm. Please notice that the translation of all of these is not I loosed or you loosed. That is a simple past, which we will be dealing with later on in the course. It's important that in your translation of the imperfect tense that you include either the word was or were. That word was or were in your translation of the imperfect tense verb helps to communicate that not only is this a past tense verb, but it's a verb with continuous action. We don't know if I finished loosing in the past or not. We just know that I was loosing. So you need to have your translation to say I was loosing, you were loosing, she, he, or it was loosing, and so on and so forth. So just keep that in mind, not to put simple past of I loosed. Now, this is the paradigm for the imperfect active indicative paradigm. One thing we taught you about Vera, not only does the Vera verb have different tenses, she also has different voices. And in the present in the present tense, you learned the active voice and you also learned the middle passive voice. Let's take a moment and now look at the imperfect middle passive voice. Here we have our imperfect middle passive indicative. It's eluamen, eluu, elueta, eluamatha, eluestha, eluanta. Notice again that just like the active voice, we have our stem that continues throughout the paradigm, and then before our stem we have our epsilon augment followed by our middle passive indicative endings. And here we have our endings are amen, u, eta, amatha, estha, antai. Anta. Couple of observations. Just as we saw in the imperfect active, in the imperfect middle passive, the first person plural and the second person plural look just like the present middle passive, amatha and estha. All right, in the present middle passive, it's luamatha or luestha. Again, this is the importance of keeping in mind the augment. It's eluamatha and eluestha. Also keep in mind that you need to include the words was or were when translating this. All right, and also keep in mind that this is either middle or passive. So eluamen can be either I was loosing for myself or I was being loosed. Eluu, you were loosing for yourself or you were being loosed. Eluetta, she, he, or it was loosing for him, her, or itself, or she, he, or it was being loosed. Eluamatha, we were loosing for ourselves, or we were being loosed. Eluestha, you were loosing for yourselves, or you were being loosed. And then eluanta, they were loosing or for themselves, or they were being loosed. Also, little potential for confusion here. Look at the second person singular ending. You've got an omicron upsilon ending. And thus far, you've seen that only in relation to nouns and the genitive case, in particular the singular, masculine, and neuter. Notice that this looks exactly like that ending, but you know that this cannot be a genitive ending because that ending only takes place when you are working with nouns. You are working with verbs here, so this cannot be a genitive ending. All right, I introduced you that in the imperfect tense, the stem is going to be preceded by an augment. We need to talk a little bit how the augment works. This is Mr. P. Hogman, and you're going to have Mr. P. Hogman here to remind us of prefixed augment, and he will be with us throughout our course as we encounter augments in the various verb tenses throughout Greek. Now, the past tense verbs in Greek will always have some kind of an augment there. Okay? You're going to be learning the first verb tense today, the imperfect verb tense that takes an augment. And so that's why you're now learning Mr. P. Hogman today. And Mr. Hogman occurs in 3 different forms. When he occurs before a consonant, then the prefixed augment is simply going to be an epsilon, as you saw with Lou. And so today, in our paradigm using Lou, you saw eluon. The blue epsilon on the front helps you to determine what is the augment. Lou is our stem, and then we put our imperfect endings. And then here's another example using the word balo. It becomes ebelon. Okay? And in this case, ebelon, all right, is I was throwing or they were throwing. But there are other times when the prefixed augment is going to show up in other ways. Okay? Let me just back up. The prefixed augment at times, when it is appears before a vowel, is going to be lengthened. And so here you see Mr. Hogman. He is standing here in a disguise because he doesn't look exactly the same way he did before, and he's standing on a pair of stilts to remind you of lengthening. And so let's look at some examples of how this happens. When a word begins in the imperfect tense with either an alpha or an epsilon, that vowel is going to actually lengthen to an eta. So in the case of the word akuo, the alpha lengthens to an eta, and we end up with akuon. I was hearing, or if it's a third person plural, they were hearing. If it begins with an alpha iota diphthong, then that alpha is going to lengthen to an eta with an iota subscript because that iota does not disappear. So for example, in the case of iro, we now result in iron, all right, was with a diphthong under the iota subscript. So note, when lengthening occurs in a diphthong, it will not disappear. Sometimes the prefixed augment will also occur in the omicron, and so in that case, the lengthening that will happen will go from an omicron to an omega. And so, for instance, ophalo will then lengthen to ophalon. Okay. Now, a third way that the prefixed augment will appear is in compound verbs. We introduced you to these last week. These are verbs in which they have been formed by combining a preposition along with a verb. And so here we have, on the left-hand side, we have the verb katabino, a combination of kata and bino, which means I go down. Okay, but notice that the prefixed augment does not appear at the beginning of the preposition. The prefixed augment still occurs at the beginning of the verb. And so in this case, you do not end up with katabino, but you end up with katabinon. That's because the prefixed augment appears between the preposition and the verb. The same thing is taking place here with apakteno. We do not lengthen the alpha on the front of apakteno because the verb, the actual verb that is appearing here is kateno. All right, kateno. And so what happens is it becomes epakatenon. So just keep in mind that when you do encounter a verb that is a compound verb with a preposition, that the prefixed augment appears at the beginning of the verb, not the preposition. Let's take a look at a few practice sentences just to help you get the hang of things. Here we have the verb balo, but now it is appearing in the imperfect tense, and I know it's the imperfect tense because I see my prefixed augment with my imperfect ending. When I parse this, this is the way it'll look. Imperfect, active, indicative, third person singular. And my translation, in order to get the imperfect continuous action, it is he, she, or it was throwing. Remember to get that word was or were in there when you're translating so that we know that you are dealing with past tense continuous action. Let's take a look at another one. This word akuen comes from the Greek verb akuo that you already learned, which means I hear. You can see that our prefixed augment at the front, when it comes in contact with the alpha on the front of akua, this is where our lengthening takes place, and so our alpha has morphed and lengthened into an eta. When I parse this, we are looking at an imperfect, active, indicative, third person singular, and it becomes he, she, or it was hearing. Next, elegan. Here, we already know that this word comes from Lego. We have our augment on the front as we would expect it, an epsilon at the beginning of our consonant, and then we have our omicron new ending. But the problem, as I already pointed out to you in our paradigm, is that the omicron new ending actually works for both the singular, first person singular, and the third person plural. So here is our parsing. This can be either an imperfect active indicative first person singular or an imperfect active third person plural. And that means in your translation that you have to determine in context which one it's talking about. So in this case, we will translate it both ways. I was loosing or they were loosing. Here we have et degs anta. Et dox adzanta. And we have our augment on the front, but the anta tells us that this is a middle passive ending. And so my parsing here is going to be an imperfect, middle passive, indicative, third person plural. And so my translation, because it's imperfect, middle passive, is going to be, I'm going to go for the passive here and say, they were being glorified. Or you could say, they were glorifying for themselves. For our last practice today, let's take a look at prasuk amen. Now, prasuk amen comes from prosukamai. Now, keep in mind that we learned prosukamai as one of those omai verbs, which is your clue when you see an omai ending on a vocabulary word that you're dealing with a deponent verb. And so this is an imperfect deponent indicative first person singular. And remember that a deponent verb is always parsed as a deponent, but it's translated as an active. But now we need to take a moment before we translate it and say, okay, but where is the augment? And even though you learned this as prosukamai with the epsilon upsilon diphthong, what you need to keep in mind is that pros is actually a preposition. And so that augment sort of sneaks its way right into the middle of the word. You wouldn't expect it to be there. So we want to point that out to you to keep in mind that prosukamai is actually a compound verb. And so your augment appears in the middle and that epsilon changes to an eta through lengthening. And so your translation in this case will be I was praying. Okay, maybe at this point you want to just take a few minutes, go over the paradigm, and memorize the imperfect, active, and middle passive endings. And you can ready to come back, you can restart the video, and then we'll move on to the next section of the lesson. Okay, if you're joining us again, welcome back. When we were going over present tense verbs, you remember that we were introduced to Amy. Amy A. Esty, and Amy was the character that introduces us to the Amy verbs. These are the verb to be, words like is and are that help make the transition and translation in Greek sentences a little easier. And there is also going to be a series of Amy verbs in the imperfect tense. And on your screen, you can see that we have Amy, but you can tell that Amy's actually looking a little bit imperfect. Her hair is a little matted down, her ribbons are droopy, and like she got caught in the rain. So this is to remind you that we are dealing with the imperfect tense. You can see that she's holding an indicator to remind you that we are still dealing with the indicative mood. Let's take a look at the paradigm. Just like you saw in the present tense, in the imperfect tense, we have a series of imperfect verbs here that are to be that stand alone. These are not endings, and you'll be seeing these as they appear in translation. Amain, I was. Ace, you were. Ain, he, she, or it was. Amen, we were. Eta, you were. And then ason, you were. You'll need to take some time and memorize these, and keep in mind that these are not present tense, these are imperfect. So I was, you were, he was, we were, you were, they were. You'll need to keep in mind to get this is was and were rather than is and are. Finally, for today, I want to bring back to you Polly pronoun. Remember that Polly is our cheerleader for pronouns because she is pronoun. And today, Polly is going to introduce us to another type of pronouns, and these are demonstrative pronouns. These are the pronouns in the sentence that actually specify a person or an object. And there are two kinds of demonstrative pronouns. There are the near demonstratives, which are words in English like this in the singular or these in the plural. And then there are distant pronouns that are words in English like that or those. Let's take a look at our paradigms for the near demonstratives. Here are our near demonstratives in the singular. These are words in Greek that mean this. And I'll give you a second just to take a look at this paradigm. And what do you notice in particular about the words that you see there? If you're looking closely, you should notice that all of these endings are the same exact endings that I've been telling you are so important to learn. They all relate very closely to the definite articles as well as your noun endings. Take a look at your nominative. Hutas is just like the as ending that we have in our nominative. Haute is just like our a ending in the nominative, or tuta. In fact, if you take a look outside of the nominative endings and you look at your genitive and your dative and your accusative, all that we've done is we've taken our definite articles like to, taste, to, and we've either added a to at the front in the nominative and the genitive, or a tau at the front in the feminative. So instead of just to in the genitive active, we have tutu. In the feminine, instead of taste, it's tautes. And in the dative, for instance, instead of to, te, to, it's to, taute, to, to. And so these are pretty easy to remember. You just need to add either a to or a tau at the front, and you need to memorize the genitive on their own. One word of caution. Take a look at the feminine nominative. Does that look familiar to you? Look like anything else you know? Well, you already see something very similar to it as aute, which is the third person feminine nominative singular pronoun she. We know that is aute, and it's a she. But in this case, keep in mind that rough breathing sound here is haute, so in this case, it's this. So here are your near demonstratives in the singular for this. Now let's take a look at the plural near demonstratives, which is how we say these in Greek. And if you look closely, you'll notice that with a sigh of relief, it follows the same type of pattern that we see in the near demonstrative singulars. It follows the definite article pattern. So we have hutoi, hautoi, and tuta. And then right along after that, tutone, tautone, tutone, tutois, tautois, tutois, tutos, tautas, and tuta. So even though you have some new things to learn here, the good news is if you've committed your definite articles and your noun endings to memory, then you already know all of these. You just have to add at the beginning the little addition of the to or the tau. With that in mind, let's look at the distant demonstratives. Now here, these look a little different than what you just looked at, but once again, look at your endings. As, a, in the nominative, in the genitive, u, ace, o, a, o, on, ain, a. All right, as you go through, you use again all of the endings that you already know. At the front, we have the Greek akain, which is added to the front of your demonstratives here, and the demonstrative endings from the various cases. Now, you haven't learned the Greek word ake yet, which means there. All right, and all they've done is they've simply added the Greek word ake. They put a helping consonant there, the consonant nu at the front, and ake and the verb, the noun endings becomes akenas, akene, akena, akenu, akenas, akenu, and it just simply means there, and it follows the case system that you're already very familiar with. Let's take a look at the plural. Here is how you say those. Akenoi, akenai, akena, akenoin, akenoin, akenon, akenon, akenon in the genitive, in the dative, akenois, akenes, akenois, and then in the accusative, akenus, akenas, akena. So the good news is, once again, you know all these endings. It's just a matter of making an adjustment to say those. With that in mind, let's look at a few practice sentences and make a few observations. In this first sentence, and this shows up quite a bit in the Bible, we have entes hemeres akenes. Entes hemeres akenes, and notice that I've translated here as in those days. Notice that the definite article will always appear with the noun that the demonstrative is modifying or working with. All right. So, and you don't translate that definite article. The demonstrative sort of overrides or takes over, and so instead of saying in those the days or in the days those, you simply translate it in good English in those days. Notice also that there is agreement of gender, number, and case. Entes hemeres is a feminine plural dative, and your demonstrative there is also in the feminine plural dative. Let's look at another one. Tuton, ton, lagan. Okay, and here in this case, the demonstrative appears before the noun that it's talking about. It can appear either before or after. It doesn't matter. But what is your clue to know the demonstrative is going with that noun is, again, that they agree in genitive, gender, number, and case. And in this case, all of them are masculine singular accusative. So tatun, tan lagan simply means this word. Sometimes the demonstrative, like the adjective, will appear on its own. And here in this case, we've got tauta, which is the nominative, the neuter nominative singular, and it means this thing. Or in the plural, if we have the accusative, or excuse me, the nominative singular, plural nominative, it means these things. Here's another example. Hautoi, hoi angeloi. It means these angels, okay, in the plural. Or let's take a look at one in the genitive that we've not looked yet. In the far demonstrative, akainoi, akainu to agathu namu. Here we are working with a distant demonstrative, or far demonstrative as I sometimes call them. We have an adjective, agathu and namu, but notice all of them agree in gender, all right, number and case. Akainu to agathu namu, of that good law. Okay, as you prepare for class, as always, learn the vocabulary for Chapter 6. Memorize the imperfect tense endings, both the active and the middle passive. Learn the rules for augment, not only the fact that it's an epsilon on a consonant, but learn the rules for lengthening. And don't forget to keep in mind that on compound verbs, that the augment appears between the preposition and the verb stem. Learn the demonstrative pronouns, which you should be able to do fairly easily because you already know all of the verb endings, the noun endings. It's just a matter of learning how they appear in the demonstrative. And then, as always, complete at least 10 of the Chapter 6 practice sentences in preparation for class. Look forward to seeing you then. See you on Wednesday.